Hello flower family, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Pam and I love all things art making, specifically heavy texture paint where I use pastry bags and piping tips to create my art. Today we're pulling back the curtain and I'm showing you the exact tools that I use to create my own art. Some may even surprise you. I'll be walking you through everything from my favorite piping tips to the unexpected supplies that I reach for all the time. So, let's get started. We'll begin with the kind of paint that I use. And I primarily use Gaffrey Art Materials heavy textured mediums. Now, when I first started, I used Golden's high solid gel. Both are great, and if you're interested, I have a video that I previously recorded that I'll post below that walks you through both types of mediums and how to mix paint in them to get the color that you want. Because I use clear gel mediums, I do have to use a type of acrylic paint to mix into these to get the custom look that I want. And I have used a variety of different paints over the past few years. Here's just a few. I like the Golden heavy bodied acrylic paint. This is a great brand, and because it is thick in texture, you don't need a lot when mixing it into these clear gel mediums. Liquitex also has a heavy bodied as well as the basics, and I've had success with both of these. Soho is another brand that I have used and have enjoyed. Again, it's going to be about personal preference and what brands that you like to use and what you enjoy using when you create your own art. And I suggest that you experiment as well when trying out these different gel mediums. I primarily use two types of Gaffrey textured paints. That is the clear gel medium that I showed you before, as well as their titanium buff. And I use the titanium buff because I like that it is not as bright as their white, and I use this as a white in my artwork. It just suits the kind of art that I do and the look that I'm going for. Now, Gaffrey does sell their own heavy textured colored paint, so if you're someone that does not want to mix acrylic paints into the gel medium, that is another option. Here are some recommendations for storing your heavy textured paints. If you're using Golden, it's pretty straightforward. They come in these tubs and they're easy to use and store. When using Gaffrey Art Materials heavy texture paints and gel mediums, they come in these plastic sleeves. The smallest size is 16 ounce and it goes all the way to 32, and the larger tubs, I believe, are 5 gallons. There are a few ways that you can store this paint after you use it. You can keep it in the plastic sleeve, you can cut the corner, use the paint however you need to, and then seal it up with a chip clip or a binder clip or whatever you have available. You can also use the paint however you need to, and then once you're done, just let the paint act as a sealant. And then when you're ready again, you will just unplug that little dried piece out and use it as you need. Even though both of these paints have been opened and sealed with either a chip clip or with a paint plug, I've never had any issues with them drying out in the plastic sleeves. However, if that is a concern for you, you could always store them in a Tupperware container. I got this from the Dollar Tree. It's about 3 for $1.25, which I think is reasonable. I will mix my paints quite frequently, especially if it's a color that I will use often, and I will store them in Tupperware containers. What I'll typically do is I'll put in the clear gel medium along with the color of acrylic paint that I'm using. It looks like here I'm using permanent green along with the clear gel medium, some white, and some cadmium red. I like writing out the list of paints that I'm using just in case I need it for future reference. I will also add the swatch of color because I noticed that it will dry much darker than it looks wet. And again, it just helps me in case I need to use it for a future art project. I've stored my paints in Tupperware containers for several months and haven't had any issues. However, if that's a concern for you, what you could do is add some saran wrap on the top of the container, or even better, open up the lid, add some saran wrap, and then close the lid, and that will give you a little bit of an extra layer of protection. If you're ever using texture paint from Gaffrey and you're having a hard time getting the paint out of the plastic sleeve, I love using a squeegee. I have one of these plastic squeegees here. It has the felt on it. You can see that it's well loved, but what I'll do is I'll start at one corner of the bag, I'll start pushing the paint up, and it helps to minimize any waste. The next step that you could do once all the paint is out, you could cut the whole bag, open it up, and then take a spatula of some sort and even get more paint, so this way there's no waste. The next thing we're going to talk about are some simple tools that I like to use to mix my heavy textured paints. Just as a reminder, these are just recommendations and not things that you necessarily need to get started on your own art making journey. I like that these tools are simple and you can find them almost anywhere. Because the texture paint has that thick frosting-like consistency, I'm drawn to using supplies that you would find in the baking aisle. There are two tools that I love the most, and that would be this palette knife here and this smaller one here. This one I think I found on Amazon, again in the baking section, but I like to use this when mixing my paints, especially in the Tupperware container. This one here is a smaller palette knife that I found in a bulk set of palette knives, again on Amazon, but I like to use this for palette knife painting. So what I will do is I will put the texture paint on the surface, I'll add some dots of acrylic color on my palette knife, and then I'll blend that in with the texture paint. And it adds a fun multi-layer color on top of my art. There are two types of surfaces that I like to paint on. One are wooden panels, which are completely made out of wood. And then there are canvases, which have a wooden frame, but then there is a canvas that is stretched around that frame. Now this one has been painted, but they primarily are white. I now primarily use wooden panels when I create my own art because I think that suits my aesthetic a little bit more. I like things that are found in nature. I create lots of flowers and things like that. I also like that I can use the wood and have that shown in my art pieces, so I will do that a lot, whether I let a little bit of the background show or the sides show. I just feel like that suits my style a little bit more. I also have used canvases and have liked those as well. It just really depends on my mood, to be honest. I think both are great. I do feel like the wooden panels are a little bit more sturdy, so that's why I'm drawn to that a little bit more, as well as the quality of the wood. For the canvases, I think they're great and I have no issues with those. I also like working with a thicker type of wooden panel or canvas because I like to take my art on the edges a little bit. And again, that's all about personal preference. If you are someone that is interested in piping with paint, I'm going to go ahead and walk you through some supplies that I use. I use these disposable decorating bags or pastry bags from Atico, but again, you can use Ziploc bags. I've not tried that, but I've heard that some artists do use those and that might work as well. I've already taken off one of the decorating bags off the roll, and I'm going to go ahead and walk you through on how to put this together. With these decorating bags, you could use a coupler. A coupler just has two parts. It has the part that goes inside the pastry bag, and then there is the part of it that also goes on the outside of the pastry bag. As I mentioned before, you don't have to use a coupler, but I like using couplers because it helps me change out the piping tips. What I'll typically do is I'll fold over the bag. I'll place the bottom one goes inside. And so you'll have this part inside of the bag, and I kind of push that pretty far so I can see it. And then I'll take some scissors and then I'll score part of that so I know what part to cut off. I'll go ahead and push that further back so I can see where that score mark is. I'll cut that part off and then I'll push that through. Now that that is pushed through, then I can take any type of piping tip that I want to use. I'll put that on, and then I will take this and I will put that over top and twist that on. And then from there, you can fill your bag with whatever paint color that you want. I have some examples here of some paint that's already in these pastry bags, as well as piping tips with couplers and some without. In the piping tip with the coupler, as I mentioned before, if you want to change out this piping tip, you can just take off or screw off this little top here. You can take out this piping tip and then replace it with a new one and screw that little part back on. Here's an example of a piping tip without a coupler. They do sell couplers that are larger in size, but I find that they're really bulky. This piping tip is too large for a normal coupler, so that's why I had to go without. Now the only problem is, if I want to use this piping tip, I'll either have to remove the paint and store it in another container, or use all the paint before I can get to the piping tip. So that's why using couplers are handy. If you ever want to take out the piping tip and leave the paint left in the pastry bag without having to store it somewhere else, you can screw off the top, and then you can find some sort of plastic, whether that be leftover from a pastry bag or some saran wrap. You can lay that over top and then screw on that part of the coupler. This will help save some of your paint. Now it doesn't last like this for very long, so you just have to be more mindful of that. Say you're done with making art for the day and you're ready to put away your supplies. What you can do is what I just showed you, taking off the piping tip, cleaning it off, putting some plastic and the coupler on, or what I do sometimes, especially if I'm going to use this the next day, is I'll just take some saran wrap and I will use that over top of my piping tip, and that will help keep things a little more airtight than if I was just to leave it out in the open. I know some artists and maybe even some cake decorators, they'll use some of these like plastic little tips. I haven't had any success with these, but if you have, please let me know. I'd love to hear your suggestions. Here's the tip if you want to use more than one pastry bag. Let's say you're working with multiple pastry bags and you're done using a color, you have to set that down. Instead of cleaning it out or wrapping some plastic wrap around it, you can put it in a shallow container of water. That will help the piping tip to not dry out. However, you just want to be mindful to not leave that in there too long, because as you know, the water will dissolve the paint and the consistency will not be as thick. The question I get asked the most are, what are these plastic sheets? Well, they're called Dura-Lar. They're a polyester archival film that come in these pads of 25. I like that they're customizable and I can cut them down to the different sizes that I need. Sometimes I'll be working on a smaller scale with smaller flowers and I'll use these small sheets of Dura-Lar that I've cut down to size, and sometimes I'll work on bigger flowers and use something like this size. Please don't think that Dura-Lar is the only thing that you can pipe on. There's so many things that you can use, such as recyclable items like cottage cheese lids. When it comes to flower nails, there are two different ones that I like to use. There's this smaller size just for smaller flowers, and then there's a larger size for bigger flowers. You can see that on top of this flower nail, I have something called sticky tack. This is what I like to use to adhere my plastic sheets onto. This is great because I find that they're very durable and sturdy, and I've never had any issues with anything falling off of my flower nail. And I've known other artists to use things like paint, and I think that works great. I love the sticky tack because I can stick multiple things onto this. You can use something like a flower cup. Instead of holding it in place and then moving it as you're piping, you can stick this onto that sticky tack onto a flower nail, and that works great too. If you like working on a larger scale, you can use something like a Lazy Susan. I believe this one is actually for pottery, if I'm not mistaken, but same idea. And I think that they sell Lazy Susans at the Dollar Tree. But this is a great option too if you want to work on a larger scale. You can set this on your surface and then you can move that as you're piping to create larger things. This is a flower that I have previously piped. It's already dry. I just want to show you how easy it is to pull this flower off the Dura-Lar. Most of the flowers should be easily pulled off any type of plastic surface, but if there's any type of struggles, I do like to use one of these flat razor blades to help that process along. So what I'll do is I'll put that right under the flower, just very carefully, making sure you watch your fingers and your hands, and that usually will help release it from the surface, and that helps it to be pulled off just a little bit easier. Sometimes you might have to go around it just a couple times depending on the flower. So if it gets stuck, same thing. But you should be able to pull it off easily with no problem. I should be able to pull that off the rest of the way. When I first started piping flowers, I thought I could use any plastic surface, and I purchased these things called laminate sheets. Well, they're plastic, but not very durable, and what I quickly realized is that they stuck to the plastic sheet and I couldn't pull it off without ripping the sheet. So I have an example here. So here's one that I first used when I started. It's very flimsy, and unfortunately the only way I can get this flower off is if I tear the plastic. Even if I use a razor blade, it won't help. So I have to pull this plastic off, and so it just makes it very difficult, and unfortunately the plastic is going to stay on the flower, which won't really hurt it because I could still use this. I just have to cut around the rest of the plastic sheet. So that's just something to be mindful of. If you're just starting out on your journey piping with paint and you don't want to invest too much up front, here are some piping tips that I suggest you try. What I really love about these piping tips is that they're versatile. You can create many flowers with them, and it's a great starting off point. The first one I have here is a petal tip, a Wilton 104. Now this one, they come in different brands. There's a Tico, there's Wilton, I think there's even like a Gem, but this is a 104 size, and they come in many sizes. But this is a great piping tip. You can create many different petals with this, and I think this one's a good one to have starting off. I also have a piping tip that's just a regular hole piping tip. This is a Wilton 4, and this is a great one to create lots of the centers of the flowers, stamens, dots, you name it. The next one is a star piping tip. This is a Tico 15, and this one's a great one to create some centers of your flowers if you want just different variety. And then the last one I have is just a leaf petal piping tip. This is a Wilton 352, and it's a great one if you just want to add leaves surrounding your flowers or to fill up your space on your canvas or wooden panel. If you're interested in me demonstrating how to use these piping tips, let me know in the comments below and I'll create a tutorial. Let's say you're really invested in piping with paint. Where do you store your piping tips? Well, if you bought a set, they usually come in these nice containers and they work beautifully. What if you extend past this capacity and you need more space? Well, you can just put them in a Tupperware container. However, if you're anything like me, I need to see what I have. So if it's out of sight, it's out of mind. So I purchased this wooden tower that primarily holds spools of thread, and I use them to hold my piping tips. If I have any extra, I just overlap the piping tips on the wooden rods, and this works great so far. What is a good way to store your art? Well, I love these cardboard boxes from Costco. We do our shopping there, and this is what we use to take our groceries to the car, and then afterward I keep the boxes, and now I have it to store my art. I will typically use these at art markets and art festivals to carry my completed pieces. So I will store them in these boxes. They stack, which is great. I can take it in my car and then take it to the festival, and it's an easy way to transport my artwork. Another great thing about these boxes is that if you're just starting out and you need some space to store things as they dry, you can use these. If you're working on something, you can stack them in these boxes instead of taking up any counter space like I have for many, many months. There's plenty of space here, but if you need more, you can always get another box and stack that on top. There's plenty of holes for airflow. It's only taking up that vertical space, so hopefully not too much room in your home. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really hope that these tips were helpful, informative, and gave you some inspiration for your own creative journey. If you have any questions, please leave them below. I look forward to connecting with you. Until next time, bye.